Hello, everyone. It's me, Anna House, the founder of Hashimoto Health, the leading online evidence-based services provider for Hashimoto Health and those who have not clear symptoms and want to prevent to get Hashimoto thyroiditis. So we have today a wonderful guest, and we'll talk about trauma and our health. And I want to start with some figures to tell you why this topic is so essential. And I think that the prevalence figures are really underestimating how big the problem is. But let's take some figures from the prevalence studies in 1995, which are showing that at least 60% of the men and 51% of the women in the general population have experienced at least one traumatic event in their lives. And we know that approximately 1/3 of the children are estimated to experience physical abuse. Approximately 1 of 4 girls and 1 of the 5 boys experience sexual victimization during childhood. So, and there are also other forms of non-abusive trauma, such exposure to community violence, that are also very common. And such forms of trauma are very important to consider because they occur repeatedly over key development periods, and thereby are increasing the likelihood of negative outcomes for our health via the chronic activation of the stress response systems. And we'll talk about how we look on trauma. There are different ways. I personally like the way Shapiro describes it in her information processing theory, and that this and she talks about the small t and bigger t, small and bigger traumas, and sometimes even a very small event from childhood, such as being teased or something that happened, being disengaged by one parent, may be really not be adequately reprocessed and leads to like a small trauma experience afterwards. So keep that in mind. Don't underestimate the experiences you had early in life. And I would like to say some words about Deirder Fay. She has decades of experience exploring the interaction of trauma, attachment, yoga, and meditation. I've been meditating since 70s and lived in yoga ashram for 6 years in the 80s. And 90s, Deirder brings a unique perspective to being in the body. In the 90s, she asked to teach yoga and meditation to those in the dissociative unit at McLean Hospital. She has amazing skills in the trauma treatment, being as a supervisor under the guidance of Bessa van de Kolk at the Trauma Center, also experiences attachment theory with 13 years of training with Daniel Brown, in body therapy as a trainer in sensory motor psychotherapy, and now is teaching integrative approach with Chris Hermer, calls radically positive approach to healing trauma. She founded the Becoming Safely Embodied Skills groups and is an author of Attachment-Based Yoga and Meditation for Trauma Recovery. Really wonderful book as to therapists, to patients, with a lot of practical information, and an author of Becoming Safely Embodied Skill Manual and co-author of Attachment Disturbances for Adults, as a co-author of chapters in neurobiological treatments of traumatic dissociation. So it's really great to have today Deirder Fay.
Put the hand on the heart even was hard, you know, and learning how to have self-compassion and make that kind of touch, all so important to do.
Yeah, I just realized it is really, I paused the recording and realized that up till now it was in pause. Gosh.
We'll have to me do it.
Oh my God. No, and we had a good talk, I think, but it was not recorded.
That happens. That's the way life can be at times.
Sorry, really sorry.
Oh, don't. That's where we can all be like, oh. So
Yeah.
we had a moment amongst ourselves. That was more important.
Yes, I had a wonderful experience, but I was really taken from this experience, I think. Yes.
It happens, honey. Not to worry.
Yeah. Shall we turn back a little bit when we started, if you
Sure.
don't mind?
Sure.
Probably to give some thoughts what you said on how you look on trauma.
Oh, let's see. Where were we? Let's talk about trauma. Well, you know what? Actually, let's start where we were with making contact with the spine and just feeling a little bit more grounded. Like, what's that like in this state versus the state of feeling triggered and reactive? Like, that's where we begin to see, like, oh, my body can calm. And the more I can take tiny moments of calm and string it together, like, okay, so I just had this. What we do, I have done many times, is I dismiss it and say, ugh, you know, so I have calm now. Most of my life is in pain or suffering. And it's not going to be, you know, I can't seem to, I don't justify or I don't value the calm. And yet the more I can have a moment, taste it in my body, the more I can begin to live there more fully. It's like, oh, and I start remembering it. And if I take a felt experience of it and literally then start remembering it or reactivating it or actively exploring that more often, then that moment actually grows and that becomes more of a habit, more of a way of being.
Yeah. And I think that probably go a little bit back what was said, that the relationship between how you see it with the trauma and physical health. What are the ways? What are the ways that trauma can influence our body and physical health?
Right. Well, I think you know that research much better than me, Anna. I think that's your area.
Yeah.
My area is really knowing like that when we do get triggered, and we do, or when we've had difficult things happen, is how do we actually land inside?
Mm-hmm.
Relearn how to be safely embodied instead of being activated and triggered.
You know, I don't know if this is your experience, but during the years, what figure out when we try to do research on and measure if there people self-report if there is early adverse event, it was and then having with some of the people face-to-face in-depth interviews, there was a big discrepancy between what was in the questionnaires and what came out in the in-depth interviews. So for me, it's like, can we rely on those questionnaires to give an information for the population? I don't think that this is just bad intention of people, they want to hide something.
Right.
I don't perceive it in this way, but I see it as not an accurate estimate then.
What do you imagine is that space between them?
What do you? I don't understand your
You said it's not really accurate. So why what's your hypothesis of why people don't accurately respond? And
because there is another definition. For example, I've been using the scale of Gilbert.
yes.
And then there is another definition how I felt and loved. What does love mean?
Right.
So you build up a definition. What does love mean? And this definition doesn't need to be a healthy one, but it is my definition. It became my definition. So I'm responding to the question from my lenses.
Beautiful, right. It's the same with compassion and the fears that we have of compassion, right? And so learning to break things down into smaller bits. I think that's incredible that you're doing that, because we do need that, because my frame of reference is going to be different from yours.
Yeah.
And how do we find what that frame is? And my experience, and I don't know what you think about this, is that if I have somebody land more in their body and be connected to themselves, like landing in their heart or landing in their spine, landing in their belly, from that place, they're going to have a different response than if they're trying to do it in the right way. Because most people in those instances will try to respond from a right way. They're trying to game it, or they're trying to know how they're going to score it, or how they're going to perceive it in a better way. And that may be unconscious, but there's so much of the attachment style that gets activated in that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I don't know.
it's, absolutely right. It's also my experience what you're saying, but not with people who suffer from sexual trauma. I've seen that people have quite difficulties from the beginning to stay in the body. So
Yes.
it doesn't matter where you would ask them to go to. It is difficult to stay in.
It is difficult, but we can, that's the beauty of it. We make those incremental moments of, and then learning how to track it so that when I'm sitting with a client that I can track when they're there and when they're not there, and then help them re-land and stay in the present moment, stay safely embodied so that they take those steps in more actively. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen so much, and certainly when I've done consultations with clients about complicated cases, is that as therapists, we're so trained to be thoughtful and reflective that we don't pause and listen to the body time that's there. And that's a very different timing and pacing than if we're talking about something, because the minds are quick and we have rapid fire thoughts and connections and associations. And so somebody could be talking, take an instant and then talk about it, but not be connected to who they are. And so I think some of our learning as therapists is how do we stay in that related space on a body level, on a heart level, so that our clients can enter that space with us too.
Great point. I'm very happy that you opened this, because I think it's most important that therapist himself or herself is in this grounded state. And this is the only way, in my opinion, that you can hold a space to someone to experience a trauma and feel enough safe to go to stay in the body.
Yes, I agree, Anna. And I love the work of Daniel Stern, the child development researcher, when he talks about the intersubjective matrix, and this then connects to some of the neuroscience stuff of Vittorio Galesi, who talks about this embodied connection that we have, that we really need to be able to be aware that there's me and there's you, and that I am living in this felt experience of you, especially when we're in therapy and we're taking the time to empty ourselves as much as we can so we can sense and be related, not just to the words, but to the experience they're trying to get us to awaken to, so that we can help them in a different way. And for me, so much of trauma is, yes, it's located in the body, but it's located in this other language of the body, this interoceptive language that is so critical for us to learn, so that we can translate that whatever is coming up, not just inside of me, but between us, so that the person for whom it's too difficult to hold actually feels held by our exploring and being curious about their inner world, not just their thoughts about their inner world, but their interior felt experience.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit, I want to bring back on the triggers, because I find it really important point, how people can learn what are their triggers and what they can do.
Oh, yes, of course, that is important. So one of the complicated things is when we're triggered, we feel like that's all of life. We forget there's a before and that there'll be an after. We forget that life literally rises, crests, and falls. And so the two things that help the most, maybe there's three, is one is, excuse me, is to have mindfulness, to know that, to see it. And it might be as simple as saying, I'm triggered, naming it, I'm triggered. Excuse me, I need some water here, I think. Because when I can name it, I create a little buffer zone, a little space from it. So if I can just say, I'm triggered, I'm triggered, I'm triggered, what that begins to do is calm the mind and allows the frontal lobes to use its capacity to calm the activation in the rest of our nervous system and our brain. So as we calm down, then we can focus more on where we want to go and say, okay, I'm triggered, but I don't want to be triggered. So if the triggered state is over here, how do I orient over here and become so fascinated with this over here that this is less compelling over time? And so I name it and then I focus over here on, it could be as simple as playing with your pet or doing the dishes, or but it has to be absorbing enough, because otherwise it doesn't activate that focus enough, or doesn't create a dopamine connection to calm down. And once we take our mind off of this relaxes us somewhat. So those are the first steps. And then there's, of course, being self-compassionate for the fact that we got triggered, or that we may have been overreactive to other people, or that we shut down and we couldn't be socially engaged in the way, whatever it might be. So we do need that huge amount of self-compassion. So then we need to look, as like, okay, so I'm here, I'm calmed down, I'm a little bit more in the present moment. So what happened? Where can I go back, and how do I slice it real thin? What was the thought I had now? What was the feeling I had? Take a very tiny moment of time. What was the thought, the feeling, the body sensation? Okay, just before that, what was the thought, the feeling, the body sensation? So I walk myself back to where I wasn't triggered. Or I start here, when was the last time when I wasn't triggered? And how did I get triggered? So I begin to make those connections and bring those dots together. Before and after. What happened in there? How did that occur? Is that familiar? Is it my normal state? Now can I anticipate when I'm going to start getting triggered? What are the circumstantial moments that will help me get triggered, or going to set me up to get triggered? And how do I not just avoid it completely, because we want to be engaged with life, but to know, okay, there's the mindfulness again. I'm going to get activated. If I go into this situation or that situation, it's going to be activating. How can I best support myself in it? How can I prepare for it, be with it during it, and then help myself afterwards? So those are all many steps of how we can be with a trigger.
Uh, I use not a trigger, like to say I'm triggered, but asking people to name it, like, is it emotion, for example, I'm a fear, or whatever it is. And it also helps, and also the different spacing it aside, so you're not anymore one with it. It's the same logic, naming. And I find very useful when people are writing down the splitting. So writing down, what is the trigger, what is the definition, what is my feeling, where I feel it in my body, and how strong it is at this moment. And they learn a lot about themselves also. When you keep this log and you look back after some time, you see patterns. So
exactly, that's beautiful, right?
Yeah.
Right. And then you can even, since we're in the compassion focused therapy world, we can write that down. Sometimes I say write it on one side, all that, and then on the other side, what would you say? What would the compassion itself say to this part that's so triggered? Or you start from the bottom and then respond from the underneath it. How would the compassion itself respond? And so we start cultivating that aspect of ourselves, and we get more familiar with it over time.
Yeah, and I think that the most important steps after this is, like, people are saying, okay, I have more knowledge about what are the triggers, I can easier stay in my body than when I've started, but where is me? Who I am? Lost sense of myself.
Right. That's why I do like the grounding techniques into the spine or into the heart, because that that thought of where am I, I'm lost, or is when we're somehow disconnected with ourselves. So again, and we may not have gotten the recording of the spine, but I can give you, we can post a link to free audios that I have, so people can.
Great. It will be great indeed, because I really think it was very useful, and I wanted to have some part that is very practical that people.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, I know. I love that too. I love that about you.
And, what about the following step of develop boundaries?
That's so important, right? That's such a big topic, actually. We could spend a lot of time on that.
I leave your space. What you want to share with this topic? Yeah.
Well, it's in some ways it's a simple thing of it's simple, but it's so not simple, right? Because we can start with the skin. Like the skin is a boundary of me, and you're out there, right? So how do I become familiar with my skin? How do I feel my sense of self filling up in this skin? Like, can I actually let myself feel that skin and realize that my skin is holding me? That's one boundary that we can have. Then I can also have people, sometimes I take a red yarn and they put the red yarn around them physically, like how big do they need it to be so that they can see that felt sense of boundary. Where am I out there? Yeah. This is all my space. What's it like to sit inside that space and know that it's me? And I did this in a workshop once, and a woman wrote me afterwards and said she took the red yarn and put it all around her bedroom, and that helped her just demarcate, like, this is my space, this is where I belong. There's simple things like that that are helpful, but the harder ones are when the psychological boundaries get intruded on and get flooded from the past or memories, and learning our attachment style can be really important, especially for those people who are more anxiously prone, because when we're anxiously prone, the weirdest thing in the world is we leave our body. It happens so automatically. We're so used to going over there in you and figuring out what's going on in you so that we can be safe and loved and connected. But it's all out there, and we think we're related because we're all out there, but we're not. We have lost ourselves and we're not connected. So again, it's learning what's happening in you. Now, as a therapist, when we do this, so much of when we see the people that we're working with in that state is when they're asking us about us, it's like, well, what's that like for you? Returning them back to themselves over and over. What's that feel like? As you have that thought, what do you notice inside? As you feel that place, do you feel rejected by me that I'm asking about you instead of telling you about me? Learning how to be in loving and warm and compassionate contact with people, so that they can land more in their body, their heart, their mind. What are they thinking, feeling, and what's the sensation?
Yeah, I see here that I missed a question, so I will just read it. So, Deirder, I don't want to interrupt, but what if your body is a trigger to feel scared?
Right. Well, that's often the case.
Yeah.
I would say practice the same thing. It's it's deconstructing the trigger. The fear, we have a thought, our body is now primed to feel fear. But in this moment, like right now with us sitting here talking, what is scary about this moment right now? And using our discriminating mind, our capacity to look and see, what am I afraid of? My body is an old habitual response. Yeah. And is that something here to be scared of? And we have to do a little bit of like calming and reassuring, and then validating, like, oh gosh, my body, my heart, I've been so used to being scared all my life that now I'm scared all the time. There's the self-compassion, right? It's validating us. But right now, then we link it, validating and then link it. But right now in this moment where there really isn't anything to be afraid of. So I have that, yes, validating the old, linking it to the new. Can I bring them together? Because, and maybe there is something in the moment to be scared of. But usually if we break it down, it isn't. Now, if there is, then that's a whole other thing. Then you have a right to be scared. But like in this moment while we're talking together, probably there isn't. But being so kind to ourselves, because, you know, once we have a triggered response, it lays down this rhythm in our nervous system, in our body, in our mind, that it becomes so familiar that becomes the norm. And that's why we need to actively find more positive states that we can relax into even a tiny bit, so that that new state becomes the new normal.
Yeah, you know yourself that there is, of course, people when they come, they have problems to go to the compassion, self-compassion. And it comes also from the attachment history they have. And they have a different experience when they start to practice self-compassion, the threat system kicks in.
Right, right.
So this can be very threatening for people. And how you work with it in your practice, and what would be advice for people when they have this experience, how they can, what they can do?
Well, there's a lot of different ones, but from a body point of view, what I'd say again is to name it. Okay, I'm feeling afraid, or I'm feeling threatened in some way. And then looking and seeing, is there something to be afraid of? And then what I talk a lot about is what this model that I've created out of attachment theory is, we protest against it. Like our fears, our triggers are a protest against something. We're saying it shouldn't be like that, right? Anytime we're triggered or activated, that's basically what we're saying is life shouldn't be this bad. It should be more fair. It should be different. And I always say to somebody, I was like, how does your body know it should be different? Like if it was supposed to be this way, it would be that way, but it's not. Your body is saying it should be different. So let's pay attention to that. Yes, you're protesting and saying it shouldn't be like that. I shouldn't be triggered. Right. You're right. You shouldn't be afraid all the time. What is it that you're wanting and needing that isn't this state? So how do we start like becoming engaged with this state? And in the yogic tradition, we talk about the opposite, and I started calling it the nourishing opposite. So that you're triggered, but what is the opposite of that state? What would you rather be? What would the state be? And the people are, I don't know. You know, compassion. I can't have compassion. No. What are you pushing against? What's the fear there? What would you rather have? So it might not be like complete opposite, but it's going to be a little bit stretching away. Like we're saying, I can't have that. I can't have that. Well, what would it be? Well, maybe what we want is just sweetness or a little bit of gentleness. Like that's perfect. Okay. That's perfect. Whatever that tiny little difference is. And then can we take it in? And I used to do this in my own healing, is working with how do I reach out and draw in just a little bit, like maybe, okay, so maybe I want more gentleness. So take a little bit of gentleness and just like, okay, that's all I can bear right now. That I can feel myself pulling away. Okay, just hang out with it. How do you be like, I just want a little bit, like what would it be like to smell that or taste that, or in a safe way? Like I get to say where that boundary is. Like maybe it's even outside the door. Maybe it's not even in the room, but okay, like what's it like to know there's gentleness out there? What would it be like to attune to that? What would it feel like in my body? What would that kind of gentleness look like? What would I see? What would the sound of somebody's gentle voice be? What would it look like, feel like, taste like, all of that. And then what does that feel like in my body? Just small. We're doing small bits and pieces.
Yeah. Yeah, great. It was really great information. Is there, I see that probably you already have another partner, so I don't want to take so much of your time. But is there something that I missed to ask you and you find important to include in this talk?
Oh my gosh, Anna, you've been fabulous. Brought out so many wonderful points. I can see why you're such a help to people. It's so important what you're doing.
Thank you.
I thank you. It's been wonderful chatting.
Yeah, it was wonderful having you. Thanks for sharing your experience. For those of you that are looking the webinar and are interested to really reprogram, to start reprogramming this stress response system when activated, we have a wonderful evidence-based product online. This is Hashimoto Heart Program. And here is the link to this. It is at Hashimoto Help website. When you go to product, Hashimoto Heart Program, and down you can see a button, invest in your health now. If you click there, you would be to the website where you can pay and go to the training directly. Would like to offer today 10 coupons for those who, and the name is Webinar Hashimoto. For those who want to make use of it, you have to know first comes first serves. So we give a 30% discount to the program, and the offer expires on the 13th of July. So you have some days to make a decision and act, and I'm sure that some of you I'll see in the training program and looking forward helping you going through this. It was wonderful having you. We're born to live, not just survive.